Picture this. A crowded martial arts convention in Las Vegas, 1995. The air thick with anticipation, cameras flashing, and hundreds of fans gathered to witness what they thought would be a friendly demonstration between two legends. Steven Seagal, towering and arrogant, his black ponytail swaying as he dismisses Chuck Norris with a condescending laugh. "That's karate?" he sneers, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I could teach a child to fight better than that." The crowd falls silent. Chuck Norris, smaller in stature but carrying decades of quiet dignity, simply nods and says nothing. He doesn't need to, because what happens next will become the stuff of legend, a moment when true character reveals itself, when the loudest voice in the room discovers that real strength whispers. This is the story of how one man's arrogance met its match in the form of quiet, devastating precision. A story that reminds us all, never mistake humility for weakness. The Golden Nugget Casino's convention hall buzzed with energy that warm September afternoon. Master instructors from around the world had gathered for the International Martial Arts Expo, but all eyes were drawn to two particular figures commanding opposite ends of the massive space. Steven Seagal moved through the crowd like a man who owned every room he entered. At 6'4", with his signature black outfit and wraparound sunglasses, indoors naturally, he held court near the main demonstration area. His voice carried across the hall as he regaled a growing circle of admirers with tales of his Aikido mastery and Hollywood exploits. "Aikido isn't just a martial art," he proclaimed, his tone dripping with superiority. "It's a way of life that requires a certain spiritual sophistication that most people simply don't possess." Across the hall, Chuck Norris sat quietly at a small table, patiently signing autographs for a steady stream of fans. At 55, his red hair had begun showing silver at the temples, but his frame remained compact and powerful. Unlike Seagal's theatrical presence, Norris radiated a different kind of energy, calm, focused, present. When a young boy asked him about his black belt in Tang Soo Do, Chuck smiled genuinely and spent several minutes explaining the importance of discipline and respect in martial arts. "Remember," Chuck told the boy, his voice warm but firm, "the strongest fighters are often the ones who never need to prove it." The convention organizers had planned separate demonstrations, but fate and Steven Seagal's ego had other plans brewing. As the afternoon progressed, Seagal's audience grew larger and his claims more grandiose. "You see, most martial arts are primitive," he announced, his voice now carrying to Norris's side of the hall. "Take karate, for instance. All that rigid, linear movement. It's like watching children play fight compared to the fluid, spiritual nature of true Aikido." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Everyone knew Chuck Norris was within earshot. The Texas Ranger star continued signing autographs, but those close to him noticed a subtle shift. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, though his smile never wavered. Seagal, emboldened by the attention and perhaps sensing weakness in Norris's silence, decided to push further. "I mean, we've all seen those karate demonstrations," he continued, now openly gesturing toward Chuck's area. "All that yelling and rigid poses. Where's the artistry? Where's the sophistication? Any street thug can throw a punch and call it martial arts." The hall had grown uncomfortably quiet. Conversations died mid-sentence as people realized they were witnessing something unprecedented, one legend openly disparaging another. Chuck Norris stood slowly, thanked the young fan he'd been speaking with, and began walking toward the center of the hall. His movement was unhurried, deliberate, but those with trained eyes recognized something else, the predatory grace of a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of controlled violence. As Chuck approached, Steven Seagal's smirk widened. This was the moment he'd been orchestrating, a chance to publicly demonstrate his superiority over Hollywood's most famous martial artist. The crowd parted like water, forming a natural circle around the two men. "Chuck!" Seagal called out, his voice booming with false friendliness. "Perfect timing. I was just explaining to these folks the difference between real martial arts and—" He paused dramatically, letting his eyes sweep over Chuck's compact frame. "Entertainment karate." Chuck stopped about 10 feet away, his hands relaxed at his sides. "Steven," he acknowledged with a simple nod. No anger, no defensiveness, just acknowledgement. "Come on now," Seagal continued. his tone growing more condescending. "Don't tell me you're offended. We're all professionals here. I'm sure you understand the difference between what you do for the cameras and what some of us do for the art itself." The crowd held its collective breath. This was beyond disrespectful. It was a direct challenge to Chuck's entire life's work. But still, the man they called the toughest fighter in Hollywood remained perfectly calm. "I understand many things," Chuck replied quietly, his Texas drawl barely audible, "including the difference between confidence and arrogance." Seagal's laugh was loud and theatrical. "Oh, that's rich!" Coming from the man who built a career on fixed fights and choreographed action scenes. "Tell you what, Chuck, why don't you show these good people some of that famous karate? I promise I'll be gentle when I demonstrate how a real martial artist handles himself." The challenge was unmistakable. The crowd's tension was palpable. And for the first time that day, Chucknorris smiled. Not the warm, genuine smile he'd shown his fans, but something else entirely. Something that made several people in the front row unconsciously take a step backward. In that moment, as Chucknorris faced Steven Seagal's arrogance, his mind flashed back to a different time, a different place. Fort Hood, Texas, 1969. A young airman named Carlos Ray Norris, barely out of his teens, standing in a dojo in Osan, South Korea, getting systematically destroyed by his Tang Soo Do instructor. "You think you're tough because you're American?" his instructor had asked after dropping Chuck for the 12th time that session. "Tough is not what you show. Tough is what you carry inside when no one is watching." Chuck remembered the years that followed, the tournaments where he was knocked down again and again, only to get back up. The defeats that taught him more than victories ever could. The slow, painful process of transforming from a shy, insecure teenager into one of the world's most feared competitors. Not through boasting or showmanship, but through discipline, respect, and an unshakable commitment to the art itself. He remembered his sensei's final lesson before Chuck left Korea. "True strength whispers. When you become truly dangerous, you will never need to announce it. The whole world will simply know." Now, decades later, facing a man who had never learned that lesson, Chuck felt the familiar calm settle over him. The same stillness that had carried him through 6 World Karate Championships. The same quiet confidence that had made him undefeated for 6 straight years. "All right, Stephen," Chuck said softly, beginning to remove his jacket. "If that's what you want." The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. One moment Chucknorris was a friendly celebrity signing autographs. The next, he was a combat machine that had been forged in the fires of legitimate competition against the world's deadliest fighters. Steven Seagal, perhaps sensing a shift in the atmosphere, tried to maintain his theatrical superiority. "Now remember, Chuck, this is just a friendly demonstration. I wouldn't want you to get hurt in front of all your fans." Chuck said nothing. He simply settled into a fighting stance. Not the exaggerated poses from his movies, but the compact, efficient posture of a man who had spent 20 years proving himself in rings where defeat meant unconsciousness. Seagal moved first, launching into one of his signature Aikido demonstrations, a flowing circular motion designed to look impressive to untrained eyes. His hands swept in elegant arcs as he attempted to grab Chuck's wrist, confident that his size and reach advantage would allow him to control the smaller man. The crowd gasped, but not for the reasons Seagal expected. Chucknorris had simply disappeared. One instant he was standing in front of Seagal, the next he was somehow behind and to the left, and Seagal's elaborate technique was grasping nothing but air. It wasn't flashy or dramatic. It was the movement of a man who had spent decades learning to be exactly where his opponent wasn't. "What?" Seagal began to say, turning to find his target. That's when Chuck struck, not with a Hollywood-style spinning kick or a dramatic battle cry, but with a simple, devastating reverse punch that traveled perhaps 18 inches and landed with surgical precision just below Seagal's solar plexus. The sound, a solid, meaty thwack, echoed through the suddenly silent hall. Steven Seagal, all 6'4" of him, dropped to his knees, gasping for air like a landed fish. The crowd's reaction was immediate and varied. Some gasped in shock, others burst into spontaneous applause, and a few simply stood slack-jawed at what they'd witnessed. In less than 3 seconds, the loudest, most arrogant man in the room had been reduced to kneeling on the convention hall floor, struggling to breathe. Chucknorris stood over his fallen opponent, but there was no triumph in his expression, only the quiet satisfaction of a lesson taught. He knelt down beside Seagal, placing a gentle hand on the larger man's shoulder. "Breathe slowly," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the hardness that had been there moments before. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. The feeling will pass." As Seagal gradually regained his composure, his face flushed with something more painful than physical discomfort: humiliation. The man who had spent the afternoon proclaiming his superiority had been dismantled by a technique so basic, so fundamental, that any first-year karate student could have recognized it. Chuck helped him to his feet with the same patient kindness he'd shown the young autograph seekers earlier. "You're a skilled martial artist, Stephen," he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "But skill without humility is just elaborate dancing." The crowd began to disperse, conversations buzzing with excitement and disbelief. Seagal straightened his clothing, his earlier swagger completely evaporated. For perhaps the first time in years, he had nothing to say. "How?" Seagal finally managed to whisper. Chuck adjusted his jacket and prepared to return to his table. 30 years of getting back up every time I got knocked down," he replied simply. "You should try it sometime." As the convention continued around them, something fundamental had shifted in that Las Vegas hotel ballroom. The story of what happened between Chuck Norris and Steven Seagal would be retold countless times in the years that followed. But its real power lay not in the spectacle of one man defeating another. It was a reminder that true strength doesn't advertise itself. It doesn't need to belittle others or proclaim its superiority. Real power, the kind forged through years of discipline, defeat, and determination, carries itself with quiet confidence and speaks only when necessary. Chuck Norris returned to his table and continued signing autographs as if nothing had happened, answering questions about discipline and respect with the same patient wisdom he'd shown all day. The young boy from earlier approached again, having witnessed the entire encounter. "Mr. Norris," the boy asked, "how did you do that so fast?" Chuck smiled, the genuine warmth returning to his eyes. "I didn't do it fast, son. I've been doing it for 30 years. The punch only took a second." In a world full of noise, boasting, and artificial toughness, Chuck Norris had reminded everyone present of a simple truth. The most dangerous people are often the quietest ones. They have nothing to prove because they've already proven everything that matters to themselves. And sometimes, just sometimes, those who mistake kindness for weakness learn the difference in a way they'll never forget. The strongest among us don't roar. They whisper, and the whole world listens.